Hello, I'm Dr. Anthony Edwards, and I'm the instructor for the Comprehensive Community College. And today we're going to be discussing workforce education in community colleges. All right, so let's start out with early development of community college workforce development programs. So the calls for community colleges to offer more workforce-based education has been around really since the 1900s, and grew louder over between then and the 1930s. And over that time, we saw an increase in the number of non-academic or non-transfer oriented programs that were not designed to prepare students to go on to a university. And by 1940, roughly 1 in 3 community colleges were providing these workforce-based programs, and several states actually, through law or policy, drafted by agencies of the state, really codified or provided structure for adding workforce development into community colleges. All right, so let's start with some definitions. And so a lot of these are used interchangeably, but we'll kind of talk about what each term means. All right, so with terminal programs, these are, if you see this term, it usually means that the programs are really designed for the workforce, not for transferring to get a bachelor's degree. Vocational, and historically that has meant agriculture, sales, and the trades. And so today, typically when we talk about vocational, we're talking about the trades, but it has included those other areas. Semi-professional, so here we're talking about things like service jobs, manufacturing, business, engineering technicians, lab technicians. So there is some professional nature to it, but not necessarily as professional as a dentist or a doctor or an attorney, things like that. Technical programs, so you might see that. So we're talking about programs that are industrial or scientific in nature. Occupational, and this tends to be the most encompassing term. And these are just programs that are designed to go into the workforce. The National Center for Education Statistics uses this, and in terms of its definitions and how it codes programs. You may also see career programs. Again, another term for programs that are designed for the workforce. You might hear like a career college, things like that. Technical college, so you may hear some of these different terms, right? Vocational school. Okay, so now these programs didn't just grow without limits, right? So what were some of the barriers? Well, the size of the institution's a barrier. So smaller community colleges typically didn't have the extra resources to offer lots of programs. So if you think about it today, I live in a rural area, and so the community college near our area, it specializes in programs like nursing, emergency medical technician, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, things of that nature. But some of the community colleges that are in larger cities offer a host of occupational type programs because they have the resources to do so. And also they may have the market analysis and community needs assessment data to show that there's a demand for those skills in that area. Also, just the perception of occupational education has been a limitation. Historically, programs, if we think about it, historically, bachelor's degree, graduate degree programs were considered to be more prestigious than community college, associate degrees, technical programs. And so community colleges already dealing with the stigma of not offering those types of bachelor's or graduate degrees, some were hesitant to take on a program that may be considered even less than the associate's degree. And so that did slow down the growth a bit, particularly before there was funding to do so. And as we usually know, funding changes people's minds, right? So we started to see more growth, particularly in the 60s, 1960s. A couple of reasons, several reasons for that, but two I'll mention here. One, that was around the time that you started seeing changes in civil rights legislation, gender, norms, things of that nature. So you had people of different backgrounds going to college at higher rates than had gone in previous years. And this even extends beyond things like, race or ethnicity or gender even. Colleges also saw more people who, had disabilities who were going to college. More non-traditional students, older students who were, going into college. Because traditionally college had been for that traditional age student who's coming out of high school. Another driver of growth is federal funding. All right, so we'll talk more about some of those federal funding sources in, I believe, the next slide or two. But obviously, without the funding, it was difficult to grow these programs. But once they started getting federal funding, and Congress wanted to incentivize folks to go into vocational training because it provided pathways to jobs at perhaps a lower cost than a bachelor's degree, but also those that were proponents of industry and wanted to increase the skills of the workforce to help grow those industries in their areas. So the federal funding did make a big difference. So some of those different funding sources included the Smith-Hughes Act of 1917, the George Dean Act of 1937, Vocational Education Act of 1963, and that was a big driver. There was while there had been some vocational components of those previous acts, this act was really 100% dedicated to funding vocational education. We also had the Comprehensive Training and Employment Administration, so not a law, but a sector of the federal government in the executive branch in 1973 that was dedicated to supporting vocational or occupational education. Carl D. Perkins Vocational Education Act, so this one is in 1984, so those of you who are familiar with career and technical education, both at the K-12 level and at the university level, are probably familiar with Perkins funds, but they fund a lot of vocational or occupational training. There's also the School to Work Opportunities Act of 1994, as well as the Workforce Investment Act in 1998. So you're getting a lot more involvement with things like the Department of Labor and things like that in terms of funding. All right, so after the period of growth, we start seeing a period of stability. We started seeing occupational enrollment slowing down around the 1980s. Now, one thing to consider here is that in that period, the number of associate's degrees awarded actually increased. So, as we'll see here, it says most of the associate's degrees were actually earned in things like health professions, business, liberal arts, but more than half of the associate's degrees awarded in 2011 were in areas that were described as occupational. So even if they weren't necessarily getting a certificate or going straight into the workforce, they had a credential that would allow them to do so, or was in an area that was considered occupational. And as we'll talk more about in the chapter, many bachelor's degrees started becoming more open universities being more open to occupational education as well, and using that credit. So the folks that may have gotten an associate's degree maybe stayed on longer and got an associate's degree, or got a certificate and they got an associate's degree, and they were able to go to college with that, while at the same time they were working using the training they got at the community college. So it sort of became a hybrid pathway. Growth in contract training in these occupational areas. So there are certificates, there are associate degrees, but there's also sometimes contract training that these community colleges would set up with employers to train their workforce, for a set fee. And sometimes fee was paid maybe by the employer, sometimes it was paid by the individual who wanted to get that training. Sometimes, it was funded by other sources. But again, in terms of occupational enrollments, again, in what we would typically term as occupational, that enrollment slowed down. Other trends, and there was also a trend, I would say, in the 1980s that was pushing, really encouraging going to college and getting a bachelor's degree, and some of that was due to competitiveness with other countries and not being competitive in that area, and so there was a real emphasis there, which may also have slowed down occupational enrollments. So, what are some of the broader implications here? So, who should be responsible, right? Who's responsible for doing this occupational education? Is it the community colleges or is it the high schools? And there was a bit of a battle there. How do these stackable credentials, you may have heard of those, where people can get training and kind of stack those on top of each other, as opposed to just getting one traditional degree, how do those align with occupational education? How do we wrestle with the competing agendas? So, political agendas in terms of trying to promote vocational or occupational education from the standpoint of maybe discouraging bachelor's degrees, the economic agenda in terms of saying, hey, there's a demand for people in the workforce who have, some training after high school but less than a bachelor's degree. So, how do we promote vocational or occupational training from that aspect? The academic argument that, maybe you've got folks that aren't quite academically ready for university life. So how do we create other pathways for them? The demographic agenda, and there's the view that some of the higher levels of education have been predominantly represented by certain groups, and other groups maybe have felt left out. So encouraging vocational to some groups felt that they were being discouraged from going into some of those higher levels. And so there's a lot of different agendas, and how do we balance that? So also, U.S. Department of Labor had gotten into this from the standpoint of creating a building block model of figuring out what are competencies and skills associated with different types of training, and kind of really explaining what that would be, so that you're not just getting a credential, but also there's the assumption that if you're getting that credential, you also have these underlying competencies that are needed in the workplace. Also, how do we balance what programs we promote to people with the demand in the job market? And also how do we compare that to new hires and job losses by education level? So one of the arguments to support occupational education is that most of the jobs that are being created don't require a bachelor's degree, which is true. What's also true is that folks with higher levels of education tend to be hired at higher rates, and also tend to be released or terminated at lower rates. So they might be working a job that doesn't require the education they have, but they tend to be less likely to lose their job and more likely to get a job, and even if that job doesn't call for the degree that they have. So how do we wrestle with all of that? Okay, issues going forward. So in terms of occupational education, what is the balance between certificates and associate's degrees? What's the integration of occupational education with traditional education? So, how do we balance that? Because there are some folks who maybe need some of the skills that are offered in traditional education. Does the literature and the writing, the civic, education, does that still have a role today? And how are we going to fund this? Right? So funding sources change. Sometimes, some places dry up. We don't have the money. So how do we make sure that we're able to fund the types of programs that are needed for students to be able to earn a decent income? Also, the view of occupational education is changing. It has gone from a type of education that was perceived as less than. If you had more skills, if you were, quote unquote smarter, you went into the bachelor's degree track. Due to the rising costs of college and the perception of college in terms of whether or not it has the quote unquote values that are shared by maybe the community at large, there's been a changing perception of the value of the bachelor's degree, along with just the rising amounts of debt that people are carrying, and the view of workforce education is increasing or improving. And so what impact is that going to have on the community colleges and their enrollment? And that remains to be seen. All right. Well, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share the video with folks you think might find it helpful. And we will see you in the next video. Bye.